Hello, everyone. I'm Raga D'silva, your host for Older Queer Voices. Today, we have with us Savitri Hensman, affectionately called Savvy, a UK based activist, writer, and a long-time campaigner for LGBTQ plus inclusion, particularly within faith communities. Born in Sri Lanka and raised in London, she was involved in founding the Black Lesbian and Gay Center in the 1980s and has spent decades working across anti racism, health, and human rights. Her writing often explores the intersections of sexuality, race, and Christianity. I can't wait to unpack with Savvy. Welcome, Savvy.
Welcome. Greetings.
So good to see you, Savvy. I know that we've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. And I must tell you that while I was, of course, we've bumped into each other on several occasions. I have looked you up. And the reason I've had to look you up is because I wasn't born or raised here. I've been here for a very short time. And as I started meeting people and the name Savvy came up almost in every conversation. So first of all, I must thank you for all that you've done for the community. And I'm going to start, with my usual question with listeners who may not be familiar with your work, like I wasn't at that time 10, 12 years ago. Can you tell us more about you, the beginning? Who is Savvy? How did you get to this point?
So I was born in Sri Lanka, Ceylon as it was then, long ago, back in 1962, and came to the UK as a small child with my parents and older sister and brother. It was a time when Black and minority ethnic communities were heavily marginalized, when basically laws around equality were in a much more backward stage. So a lot of kinds of discrimination weren't even outlawed, and a lot of the kind of rhetoric that now would be regarded as embarrassing, even in certain circles that are not that keen on equality, were regarded as quite normal in the media and so forth. In fact, sex between men had not even been partially decriminalized at that point. So we're talking about a long time ago. There was a lot of racist stereotyping. Lesbians in general were largely invisible. Gay men targeted. People who were bisexual or trans even more invisible. Um, and a lot of kinds of discrimination were underway. There were also obviously class divisions and social and economic inequity, though there were also people, strong voices advocating against this. So this was the UK into which I came. There were notorious politicians such as Enoch Powell giving talks about rivers of blood if people like my family came to this country, which seemed, I think, even at quite an early age, bit of a strange perspective, since, for instance, my mother was a teacher. She was doing really valuable work. My dad worked in broadcasting, journalism, and so forth, and again was contributing to society. And so many of us were doing that. So this was the backdrop, and it was a time when I think there were a lot of positives. There were movements for social justice, from which I learned so much. And LGBTQIA plus people were not as marginalized as might have been the case a half generation before. So there were some people I knew who were out gays, for instance, as a child, but there were still very few, in fact, practically no images online of, there wasn't an online to start with to go to find images, but in the mainstream media and in everyday life, in the newspapers, magazines, and so on, there was practically nothing about people who were out, um, LGBTQI plus people, I would say queer, people of color, people of global majority heritage. It's very difficult to find that. So actually coming to terms with who one was, because a bit of a challenge. Um, so I became involved, I suppose, in anti-racist activism as an adolescent, and I also began to think through my sexuality and increasingly recognizing that I was rather different from most other girls. I wasn't really sort of hooked by sort of young men who were the pop stars over whom the other girls might swoon, or the boys from the local boys' school backing each other with their satchels. They weren't really the objects of sort of amorous interest or whatever to me. So it dawned on me that I was different, and I did some exploring. I had to think through the ethical issues. Now, at that time, there was kind of assumption in a lot of faith circles that actually acting on feelings towards people of the same sex or gender was wrong. I mean, it was perhaps all right to have those feelings, though some very strict groups were against it. And sometimes this wasn't really explained, it was just in terms of tradition or a very narrow interpretation of scripture, or it was because a lot of people just assumed that we would be missing out on something important because we wouldn't be able to have the same depth and quality of relationship as people in heterosexual relationships. So this was widely taken for granted, and it was a bit self-fulfilling in that actually then people who were in same-gender relationships and people who were exploring their sexuality and gender identity more widely would just miss out on something that, quote, normal, unquote, people would experience, and that it might also undermine family values. And families, communities were very important, especially for people of global majority heritage, in a society where we were very often targeted, sometimes quite openly. There was racist violence not that far from where I live, um, that took people's lives. Sections of the state, especially the police, were themselves often very discriminatory and even violent. So it was a time when it was quite challenging in various ways to think through one's sexuality in terms of broader identity. But on the positive side, my family were very much into social justice, working towards a more compassionate and fair society. So that was helpful too. And I suppose I was brought up to believe that one sometimes had to take chances in terms of working for a better world.
Brilliant, brilliant. Sari, thank you for sharing that. I just, as you were talking, I was thinking about, like, I'm trying to go back to the 1960s, but I'm assuming it's more about 1970s that you're talking about when you're adolescent teenage life. And it's interesting to know because, again, watching a lot of television, Netflix, there are documentaries on the how it was at that time here in the UK for people from marginalized and minoritized groups. And how, while you were doing the whole anti-racist protest and movement, and when there was no visibility for the gay people, LGBTQ, because, right, as you said, rightly said, we didn't have online at all. We just had media here and there, right? Newspaper, magazines, or some local publications that may have some information about maybe underground LGBTQ movement. So in all that, how were you able to understand your own, like you said, you felt different, you didn't go with the norm. So, but how did you know who you were?
I had to do a certain amount of reading and learning. Now, there was some visibility and knowledge, and it was the sort of family where you encouraged to read and find out about things. And I knew some people who were involved in broader left movements, for instance, who were gay. I mean, by the time I was a teenager, the Gay Liberation Front was off the ground. So there was growing visibility in various sections of society, and occasionally somebody might appear on TV. They might not even be in profile with their face obscured to protect them. So now and again, there were people who were more visible in the media and in everyday life. But it took a certain amount of, for instance, delving at the local public library down the road from me. And I was quite nervous if anybody came while I was looking at books on this subject. But I did gradually discover that it probably wasn't that uncommon. And in later life, obviously, um, it became clear that there were various people whom I knew, but I never knew they were uh, queer. Because, of course, it wouldn't have always been obvious. And if they were young, it might have taken time for them to explore who they were as well in my generation. So I became more aware of what sexuality might be. That, I mean, we were emerging from the days when actually some people were subjected to aversion therapy and other fairly drastic forms of treatment to try to stop them being or lesbian or bi or sometimes trans, which didn't work in that way particularly well, but could leave people quite badly damaged. So partly because of protests and also because some medical professionals and other people of goodwill were pushing against it, that was going out. But some of what I read was quite daunting. Nevertheless, social and political conditions were changing. It was becoming a little easier to be out. And I was also able to read quite a lot around the theological issues and recognize that actually this was part of my capacity to love. Now, in my faith tradition, love is something that shouldn't just be directed towards a romantic or a partner or a spouse. It's something to be acted on more generally, but actually loving a person intimately and getting to know them and caring for them and working through some of the challenging work partnership with them to care for others is an important part for many of us of that journey. And I realized that actually, if I didn't act on this, I might be either getting into a relationship that I couldn't really sustain very well, that might be harmful to me and the man concerned if I tried to go straight, or I might be cutting myself off from something that could actually be a source of growth and nurturing. So I was able to find out more about some of the thinking around those issues and decided by the time I was about 16 or 17 that it was okay to be who I was and act on those feelings if I found a special other to do that. But then came working out how and when to come out, and I'm glad I can do that at school because I think that could have been quite a risky proposition. So when I went to university, in about around
So,
the
so,
end.
so, so, sorry, so how was it? Because when you're that young, there are two places that most important to you. One is home, of course, that you need to talk to your family, and then, of course, is the university where you're studying, or a workplace if you're working at a young age. So there are two elements to this, right? So, two. One is, did you feel safe enough at home to say who you were? And from what I hear, that your parents were quite liberal and open. And at the university, how was it? Because again, we're talking about a movement which had just started in 1972 with the Gay Liberation Front. So how safe did you feel wanting to come out?
I think I didn't know at first how my parents and those around me would react. Now, looking back, I think there was probably never any chance that they would have rejected me. But at that point, originally in the 70s, they wouldn't have approved of same sex partnerships. This was a very common view in Christian circles. They then did a lot of so when I came out to them, I was quite nervous about that. But um, though it was clear that they wouldn't reject me at that point, and they uh, weren't fully on board with um, where I was in terms of thinking, then did a lot of learning themselves and reflection, and maybe discussion with close friends and reading and so on, and changed their minds so that when I started a relationship when I was in my mid-20s, they were welcoming and supportive, and my partner became another daughter to them. So I was very lucky in that regard. My siblings and their spouses were supportive from the beginning. I'm the youngest by far of my generation, and so I did have support around me when I came out, and my journey was much easier than that of many people. But it's also worth remembering that there are a lot of us in global majority circles who have very varying experiences. There isn't a one size fits all. So some of us may, for instance, come out into fairly radical left circles where people are thinking and sometimes changing their minds about various issues, at a time when, for instance, feminism was explored and its different dimensions across the world. Um, and so that was, I suppose, much better surroundings than some people have, where they may come out into very um, conventional or socially conservative circles where people are very worried about reputation and how this will affect who marries whom or where your social status is in the community. I think my parents weren't so obsessed with that. It was more an emphasis on trying to do the right thing. So I was lucky in that regard. Um,
And just coming to the present, just on that note, I'm just interested in, this is now in the 70s and now we are in 2026. I'm just going to come back to the present. Do you see, because I know that you are very much part of our, still an activist, still much part of the community. Do you see much changes
yes.
within
So
families? Yeah.
in you mean in families or my
In,
family?
in within your family, there's always acceptance, as I hear from you. But I'm asking about families outside of your family, the other families, people who are coming out now, have come out in the last 5 years. Do you see any changes within the Christian family, let's say, for instance, the faith families?
Yes, there has been a huge change in many ways. So, firstly, in global majority circles in the West, it's far more unusual for people to think that it never happens to us. At one point, a lot of people just thought it was something that Westerners did, though Westerners going to the colonies as they then were, as I later discovered, sometimes thought it was something that 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 non-Westerners did, and their people didn't do unless they were very strange or breaking the rules very badly. So it was a case of in those days of sometimes disbelief or a struggle to figure out how it could be really your son or daughter or niece or nephew or a member of your community who was queer, which isn't the case so much now. And in the Christian family, so to speak, it has also become increasingly apparent that we exist in fairly large numbers, and that we can actually lead that variety of lifestyles that heterosexual people, people who are not queer in any regard, lead themselves. That where there isn't some kind of particular queer lifestyle that involves throwing out all kinds of seriousness about relationships, for instance, or interpersonal trust and love. So I think it's a case where there has been a change, and theological thinking has developed very fast. So there's a huge amount that's been written now. I mean, it would probably take a lifetime to read even some of the, even some of the books and articles that have come out in the past 40 to 50 years, see. So there was sort of burgeoning theology when I was um, even by the time I was born, and by the time I was a teenager, there was a bit more. But there's been a lot more thinking now, and by and large, attitudes in the pews among ordinary Christians have shifted so that the number of people or the proportion of people who think that same-sex partnerships are always wrong is quite low in most churches in the UK. It does vary across the world, though, and in different faith communities. So in some of those, there has been an increasing visibility. But at the same time, in recent decades, there's also been a shift towards more reactionary, even um, fundamentalist types of faith. And I don't mean closer to the fundamentals. I mean where I suppose power seeking gets confused with being devout or holy or pious. And so you get people, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not deliberately, using faith to keep others under control. And sometimes politicians step into that as well, and they use it to stir up divisions or take attention away from their own shortcomings. So faith gets roped in that way. So in some ways, And in some places, things have gone backwards, and in others, they've gone forwards.
Good. And I'm just going to talk about something again you touched upon, which is very much part of a religious faith kind of environment, and of course medical as well, is conversion practices. And you talked about conversion practices being there. And I know even today, when I speak with our South Asian people who reach out to me, they talk about things that their parents have put them through, will in the form in the name of religion or in the name of getting them help from a medical professional. So can you give us a couple of examples during that time in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, what was happening? And do you see any instances yourself currently as well that's still being practiced, and how do we change that? I know that we are, the whole group of people are talking to the UK government to ban conversion practices. And when do you feel hopeful about that coming through as well? Sorry, three questions in one. One about the past conversion practices, one right now, and also how hopeful are we about the UK government banning the conversion practices here?
Okay, in fact, I'll start from the end. I think that to get a ban, it's important perhaps to focus on the more extreme end of conversion practices, what might be regarded as conversion therapy, where to start with, there's a sort of often pseudo-therapeutic language used, even if the practice is solely religious or not obviously therapeutic. So there may be a lot of what I might call nonsense psychology thrown into it about how somehow the person has erred and strayed, or their parents have done something terribly wrong, or it has been passed on through generations for this to happen, and the person is not adjusted properly for some reason, and then something drastic needs to be done to change that person, and a huge amount of pressure is put on. Uh, I think that that's different from ordinary attempts to persuade people to follow a particular set of practices in terms of whom they love and even to some extent who they are. And it can be a difficult dividing line, but I think if we pitch this too broadly, so that it just sounds as if a lot of attempts to change people's minds, but where it might be just an expression of a genuine view, however flawed, which can then be argued against because it's actually often very rockily situated. So if you actually go back to the basics of faith at its best, there are very strong reasons against in most faith traditions, and that can be argued. If that becomes lumped in with things that are actually coercive or involve, I suppose, pseudo therapy, things that might actually be banned for medical reasons, just as we or might be strongly discouraged, where claims may be made for certain things. Oh, buy this drug and it will transform your life, when actually it's either just a load of chalk or something, or something that's actually quite dangerous. So I think that there's more chance of getting it through if we are clear about what it is and is not, and that exploring people's identity is a normal part of therapy, but trying to change that in a permanent way isn't necessarily so. And suggesting that young people take their time, for instance, you may not know for certain whether you're going to be lesbian or gay as an adult when you're 8 or 9, but but very often people might have a sense of where they are going to be later. Asking people to take their time is different from trying to pressure them in a particular direction. Well, you couldn't possibly be this, could you? Or if you are, you know that this would be really offensive and terrible and awful, and you might get shunned, and using um, means that are overstepping the mark, bringing people into a circle of others and bombarding them with questions or rather menacing comments that might undermine their ability to make a free choice. So I think honing in on what's worst may actually help to get this legislation through, because it is long overdue. Um, in terms of the kinds of practices that were around, as I said there that at one time you got physical kinds of aversion therapy, which is appalling and may still be happening in some parts of the world. Criminalization as well, which is a form of violence where you lock somebody up not for doing anything harmful to another person, but because the state doesn't like a relationship that they're in, even if it's between two adults who are fully consenting. So these are things that are now not regarded as acceptable in much of the world, though still in some parts of the world this may go on. But in terms of faith communities, sometimes beneath the radar, things can go on that are pretty unacceptable, and or among sets of people who might think it's part of preserving their culture, in inverted commas, though actually it's about enforcing some particular view of what culture is. I mean, it's continually evolving and developing across the world, and often there are traditions that go back centuries or thousands of years of same-sex love or different ways of experiencing and expressing gender identity. But these are often buried or ignored. So sometimes in certain communities, and this may also apply to white British people who are told that to be properly patriotic and defend Western values, you have to be straight or pretend to be straight or try to fit in with this. Uh, in those circles, you can get various kinds of pressure applied even now that can be quite destructive, that echo some of what went on in the past. And in some ways, this again may be renewed as the far right gains ground.
Yeah, okay. I'm just like interested in understanding, when did now Savvy become a become an activist? I know that in the 1980s, like we spoke about, you said the Black and Gay Lesbian Center opened. And so how was that the first thing you did as an activist, like a proper activist hat, or did that evolve into what that was?
Well, I think I can remember in the late 60s going on at least one anti Vietnam War demo with older family members. Because I think even as a young child, you can tell that it's wrong to drop um, napalm on other children, for instance,
Yeah.
and sort of wage wars of conquest that kill lots of people in order to make some people more rich and powerful. So I suppose I have been active in various movements for quite a long time, and then by the 70s, as I was in my teens, I I guess I became active in anti-racist campaigning. There was a lot of that going on in East London back then, and I was living in East London by that time. And then there were national campaigns such as around the Bradford 12, which people can look up if they haven't come across that. There's been some interesting work on that in recent years. So there was a lot going on even in the 70s, and I became involved in that. But it was really in the 80s that I became active in, I suppose, um, campaigning for queer rights and inclusion, and then got roped into some other kinds of campaigning and struggles as well. Um, for instance, at that point, I didn't identify as a disabled person, but by about I think the early 90s, as people began to, or more people began to campaign stopping the buses, for instance, in protest at them being inaccessible. Because I'd been active in anti-racist spaces and done observing back then, friends got me involved in standing around and taking notes in those spaces. And I would later become much more active in the disabled people's movement as the years went by. I became disabled myself. I became involved in working against violence against women and girls. So there were a variety of ways in which I would become an activist. But I suppose from the earlier stage, there was a recognition that this was a vastly unequal world in terms of socio-economic inequality, that often goes alongside other kinds of oppression and injustice. But I think it's difficult to ignore, and sometimes it's very stark, the levels of poverty existing against huge wealth. Sometimes it's less obvious, but a lot of the time that makes it even more complicated for people to break free of other kinds of oppression and injustice.
So was it? Did you think of the idea of opening that Black and Lesbian Gay Center? Was that your idea, or was it a collective?
there, there were other people who were pioneers. At that stage, the lesbian and gay Black group had got off the ground, and in fact, an encounter with that, I think it was the gay Black group at that time, was perhaps my first encounter without queer people of colour. It was on a Bradford 12 demonstration, I think, at a service station on the way either to or from Yorkshire, and I was impressed. They played a key role in this. There was a Black lesbian support network. So in many ways, I benefit from the work of others who were out and proud before me and who were able to connect those different aspects of their lives. Um, but I was one of that first set of workers in 1985 and ended up being the longest serving worker at the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre. And I had also become active at that point in working for change at local government level, particularly in Haringey, as gradually equal opportunities became more noticeable and prominent in local councils, and then there was a pushback at national level and so on. Likewise, at regional government level, there was progress and also opposition. So I suppose I was I was not the pioneer. There were others who did that, but I guess, part of that, maybe that first generation of people who felt more, or well, not quite the first generation. There were also people rather older than us, but part of that first set of people over a small period of time who felt able to be out in circles that were beyond immediate family and friends, to appear on the media and so on, which made it that much easier for other people to say, actually, maybe these feelings that I have aren't so strange. Maybe they're authentic. Maybe I can live my life at some point in a more open way, or at least it's all right to be who I am. And so there was a lot of change going on in a short period of time. This built on what others had done much earlier, but I think I was part of being, I suppose, that shift in society, and played a part in that alongside others.
Wonderful. So did you, because I was part of the Resist campaign, the one exhibition at Queer Britain, London. So we were workshopping. Veronica, was doing the workshops with us, and I read so much about the work of Black and gay, so Black Lesbian and Gay Center, and I was just like thinking things like even the documents around, for instance, dating. I was like, what? This is like how, I mean, we don't even think about it in 2026. These days, people have online Hinge or Tinder, whatever else they use, WhatsApp. You go to events, you meet each other, and we're talking about a time. And I saw this little pamphlet, which said, you gave your name, you gave your age, and you said this is you would like to meet someone, and they had to contact. And then, please tell us more about how that worked.
So there were, I mean, it worked in different ways in different circles. Uh, Originally, a lot of dating might have happened at either the occasional club or party, and you had to know where it was, and sometimes there might be something of a signal that you needed to give in order to be admitted. And if you weren't in the know, or you were a long way away from a big city, this would be pretty problematic, and it would be more difficult if you were a woman very often, because it
Yeah.
might be harder to get out from wherever you were in terms of a domestic situation and go back home and not face too many questions, whereas men in particular might find that easier. So there were a lot of challenges sometimes in forming relationships. Then, if you're going to do it in terms of sort of the post, were you able to open your post in a discreet place, and so it was so those, and keep that letter yourself, or open that newsletter and put it and store it somewhere where someone might not stumble across it, which could be a very awkward situation. So it there were challenges that didn't exist, that don't exist today. On the other hand, there were also certain benefits in being able to take things slightly more slowly and meet people in real life, and not and there was perhaps was a not as much temptation to be as rude as people can be sometimes using dating apps, because there can be this tendency these days to be very dismissive, and it's fine not to be attracted to somebody, but there can be ways of expressing that aren't about being horrible, and so maybe there was a bit more encouragement to be more courteous, though it didn't always happen. People could still
Yeah.
unpleasant.
And ghosting these days, I think there's a word called ghosting, right? People just disappear from your life, no explanation given, nothing. And I was doing a podcast recording the other day with someone else, and they said, oh, she said, I also did ghosting in my times in the 70s and 80s, and we just didn't go back on that date, and nobody told anybody, we just walked away. That's interesting to know. I want to actually talk about this with you, about dating in the present times for older people, because now I live in a place which has 19 apartments for older people, and I know some of our friends here in the community have been in long-term relationships with their partners, and their partners have passed away, or and they don't have families. Some of them by choice don't have children, or if they have children, they have moved on. So it becomes difficult. And I know that the men here, the gay men here, say that we would love to have a companion at this age, but we don't know where to go, or there are scams. If they get involved with somebody, then they are financially scammed or emotionally scammed. So tell me your experience around it, and is there any opportunity, any way now for older people to find someone their age, or whatever they're looking for, love, companionship, emotional support?
So I had a 24-year relationship with my partner, Vijay Tara, Sharon Smith, as she was originally known and continued to be known for sort of work and academic purposes. And then she died of cancer
So,
when we both were in our late 40s. So I had that benefit of a long-term relationship, but I haven't dated since then. Though I do have family connections based on that, which include caring responsibilities. So that has continued, even though she died 15 years ago. So I, I guess I'm not the perfect person to talk about dating when older, but what I would say is that we probably needed to create more spaces where people can socialize with one another, which includes older people, with older people as well as across generations. Um, Perhaps learn to challenge some of the ageism, and it's fine to be attracted particularly to those of a different generation, either much older or much younger, but also not to assume that just because somebody is older, they're unattractive, uh, not to absorb society's standards so deeply, and not, and to recognise that there may be positives as well of being an older person, and older people can be very attractive. So it's, but at least creating those spaces where friendship can happen, and then sometimes love, attraction, wanting to deepen that friendship into something that goes further. can happen. And perhaps there aren't enough spaces of that kind. Um, so I think it is a challenge, and I think one of the big problems now is that with a health and social care system under huge pressure, those with care needs in particular can be hugely vulnerable. And so people might have been out of the closet for decades and now have to go into the closet again just to protect themselves from abuse. I mean, that's been the case for some disabled people of all ages for a very long time anyway, where sometimes you're so reliant on another person that you can't afford to risk being out, because horrible things can happen to you if you are. But this is a major problem, and I think that needs to be tackled in order to give some older people more space to be themselves. And again, it's very variable. So some of us may be in big cities, and if we have to go into a hospital or receive care, we might be in spaces where we can receive that from people who are respectful of who we are and the families that we may have. And again, even if it's not a romantic connection, you can have people who are like siblings in many cases, and you can get queer families that are made up of that, or perhaps with romantic partnerships for some people, or a mixture. Some of us may be part of blended families, as I am. So um, family members who I might describe as being part of an inherited family, whom I'm very glad to have as my family, as well as, I suppose, an acquired family over the years. But I think creating spaces where we can be ourselves can be really important in terms of having relationships in general and creating space for romantic relationships, even among older people.
Yeah, no, that's really good that you pointed that out. In fact, Savvy, I was going to bring my next question was going to be about care homes and aging and the healthcare system. I don't know whether you're aware, and I put a report out on my LinkedIn page about the first roundtable that we held at the House of Commons, and we had people who joined in. There were about 60 people. Some of them were asked to make a provocation, and what the theme that came across was exactly what you said, that the healthcare system, particularly the care home system, is basically not built for aging queer people, and it needs to be rebuilt. And there were, of course, Ted Brown was there, whose partner Noel had gone through huge amount of abuse at the care home. And I just want to understand. I mean, I know you're not there yet and you have a long way to go, but we're all aging. I'm aging myself. I'm in my mid 50s, and you're a little older than me. Do you fear the using the care system, as a lot of people said? And if so, what do we do about it? Do you have any thoughts around it?
Um, and I remember what happened. I mean, Noel was a lovely person. I mean, I didn't know him very well. I knew Ted. I know Ted better. Ted was active in the Black Lesbian Centre as a management committee member at some point, more generally in campaigning for justice and equality. But that was a reminder of how even somebody who is a lifelong activist, as Noel was, can find themselves in a situation where they are extremely vulnerable. And I would be daunted to be in that sort of space, because increasingly people of my generation may not be able to do everything that I might need when I'm more frail and unwell. Um, I think that the challenge is to change the care system overall. I don't think it can work solely for queer people. I mean, certainly we need to create more spaces that are queer friendly, perhaps look at having care homes or other kinds of spaces that are more designed with us in mind, and certainly making sure that training and support and guidance for staff in this field does take account of diversity of all kinds and the creating of respectful relationships. But I think when the whole system is so strained, it puts everyone at risk for multiple reasons. And I think that earlier principle that people in the disabled people's movement emphasized and continue to emphasize about the right to independent living has to be emphasized again. It's not about not wanting people to be cared for by family and friends. That's going to be very important, but not being so reliant on them that that becomes the dominating feature in your relationship anyway. You know, if you're no longer parent and child, whatever, but you're just one person who's caring for another, or just no longer a spouse or sibling, but it's very one-sided, then that can put a strain on relationships as well. But certainly people shouldn't be in that position. And what's happened is that care has been withdrawn further and further after that drive towards creating greater independence, towards making sure that that care was properly resourced so that people could live in the community, contribute to that, enjoy the same benefits, give to other people around them. Um, I think that things have gone back a lot, so that the care system is seen as a sort of, well, maybe if you're very lucky, we will help to make sure that you get fed at least once or twice a day and get a sip of water after waiting several hours in the hot sun, or or get picked up after lying all night on the floor if you're very lucky. But we might be too overstretched to do that. So I think society has gone back a lot on the notion of public services in general, and the idea of having universal services, which we pay for when we can, or contribute to when we can, when we've got the health and energy to do that, and which might benefit us when we need that. So I think returning to having a properly resourced social care system, having adequate care for people with primarily health needs, but ongoing health needs, which is again has been badly cut, and help for people when they've got urgent health needs is important. We know that socioeconomic disadvantage and discrimination can badly affect anyway the likelihood that people will need additional support or become ill, often at an earlier age. And we also know increasingly through research as well as everyday knowledge about the ways in which the systems can be geared towards some kind of supposed normality that actually leaves out large numbers of people. And for some queer people, it can be more drastic than for others. But in general, the systems are not designed very well for more diverse people. So even if individuals are trying to be caring, they can find themselves coming up against systems that are just designed without our communities in mind. I mean, there may be particular challenges for people who are trans, and so you may have some kind of computer or sort of chain or a decision chain type systems that just don't take their physical and social reality into account, and they get sent round in circles, and even their health professionals are struggling to get them the care they need. But more generally, I think systems need to be redesigned and people trained and just equipped to provide support to the people who need it. It may sound hugely expensive, but it can be hugely expensive not to have those systems in place, and for people not to get support until they're in an extreme situation, and then to have things like inquiries and so on when things go extremely badly wrong, and people say this is really bad until the next time that it happens. So I think a real change is needed. I'm guessing.
I agree with you. Yeah. We've got a next roundtable too, which is happening on the 29th of July. And then we're going back to the parliament in November to have this conversation exactly on these things, listening to people, listening to older people who are aging, who are struggling with the healthcare system, on what do we need, where are the gaps, and how can we rebuild the system. Like you said, not building the system is costing us lots more than it would cost to build the system. And
I
I,
I've also been a carer and remain
okay,
a
yeah,
carer for
yeah,
members of
sure.
my own generation and the older generation, for my late parents. So I am aware that it's a system where it's been under strain for a long time, but now it's large. become really dysfunctional, and there's a need to reset that and make it much more inclusive for everybody.
And I hear you, Savi. Savi, we're just nearly at the end of our wonderful, wonderful discussion. I have two simple questions. One is, back in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, when you were born, of course, and Sri Lanka, it is still criminalized, right? Being an LGBTQ plus is still a criminal activity. What do you think? Do you think a change will happen there? And are you part of that fight as well in Sri Lanka?
I haven't been central to that fight, but it is definitely something that I think is needed. So for a long time, this was, I think, something inherited from British rule that many people might have been rather skeptical about enforcing. The fact that, for instance, sex between men was criminalised. Um, but even if people were socially conservative, they probably wouldn't have thought that it was a key duty of police not to stop armed robbery or whatever because they were too busy interfering in what two people of the same sex or gender did between themselves. Um, but what has happened is that for various reasons, successive governments since independence have hung on to this law, and in terms of equalising it, have equalised it by extending it to more queer people rather than getting rid of this law altogether. And again, people who are trans have been part of, I suppose, South Asian communities for a very long time. But again, that has also become potentially more difficult in some circumstances than it might have been when I was born, which is definitely moving in the wrong direction. So I think there has been a huge push, and there have been various promises from sections of the government. But the current government, though I think that most of the people in it, in leadership, are aware that that this criminalisation is wrong, are too afraid, I think, in many instances, of offending certain religious leaders,
Okay.
and generally pushing back against injustice. That they're allowing this to stay in place. I would really like to see some action soon, because if you want to create a more just society for everybody, sometimes you have to be bold enough to take action and explain why you're taking it, and trust that a large proportion of your fellow country people will actually be in favour of that, because there have been huge struggles for justice of all kinds in Sri Lanka, and a lot of people recognise that social injustice is wrong, even if they've got different views about family life or identity, whatever. That using the force of the state to punish people for who we are, if we're not harming anybody by that, if we're consenting adults, that is wrong and oppressive. So I think it's time to see change across the world and stop clinging to sort of Victorian values and practices as if this were some kind of wonderful goal to go back to the way that we were in say, or that England was in the days of the empire at the close of the 19th century.
True. And Savi, my final question to you is, where to from here? What's next for you?
Well, I think that I have recognized that I am getting older, so some of the things that required more energy are harder for me to do now. But I have learned a lot, and I continue to learn a lot, including from people from younger generations. I think we can all learn from one another, um, and hopefully we can all grow, discover that perhaps things we thought before weren't fully correct, or that there are new ways of doing things that wouldn't have occurred to us earlier, or just wouldn't have been around when we were younger, or where we can learn from people of other generations. So I think there's still a lot to do in terms of this and other struggles for justice more generally. I think we're living at a time when there are huge challenges. There's been a growth of militarism, which is often tied in with a very crude idea of what masculinity is or should be, and a wish to push back women's rights, queer rights, and so on, as well as roping in men to something that is ultimately very destructive of them, sometimes physically destructive of them. Um, there is a surge in the far right, and I'm very aware in Sri Lanka, from the Sri Lankan experience, this happens in South Asia as well as other parts of the world, that cruelty and injustice aren't confined to one set of people, that all communities can be pulled towards very destructive ways of being. We're seeing this in India today, and as well as in a lot of Europe, in the USA. So there is a lot of struggle to be done and a need, I think, to link different movements, not in the sense of not never having single issue campaigning, because that can be vitally important, but even if it's at a very small local level, people acting for one another, showing solidarity, care for one another, taking action, not just feeling helpless in the face of what's wrong, doing things that make their communities better, as well as taking a stance against what's unfair and cruel and harsh to others. So these matter, these struggles matter too, but also recognizing that all of us, or more of us, need to work together for a better world if we're going to head off that push towards, I suppose, a downward spiral that puts all of us at risk. And I think those of us who are queer people of different generations can contribute to that alongside others.
It's wonderful. I mean, I think it's a perfect note to end our wonderful interaction on our podcast, Older Queer Voices Podcast. I will bring you back, Savi, because I think there is so much more that we need to talk about. And if you're happy, we may have a panel discussion at some point, conversations around exactly this and more. I mean, I haven't even touched upon 1/10 of what we need to speak about. But thank you for sharing. I'm going to say your wisdom, because I've learned so much from just listening to you and talking to you, and also so openly sharing. And very sorry to hear about your partner. I'd known about it, and I'm really, really sorry. And you know, we are all in this, and if there's anything we can do in any way, and we will. And Older Queer Voices is set up to create a space for storytelling, of course, but storytelling that makes a change. Like, that's how we said, changing the narrative, because we need to. I think all of us collectively, you've done so much of work. We need to just make sure that that work is not going to be dismissed or forgotten. We just work towards the next steps with you all. Okay, so thank you very, very much. And for me, your work highlights the importance of holding together different parts of identity and still continuing to push for justice across communities. And I love that the way you ended it. There's so much work to be done, and everyone who can contribute, who is able to contribute, I think we should contribute. We're not waiting for other people to do our work. We need to do our own work as well. So thank you for that. And before I sign off, I want to thank Nicola Fenton, who's the other better half, I'll say, of Older Queer Voices. Thank you, Nicola, and also to all our audience who listen to this. And Savi, we haven't had a podcast recording other than the one I did 2 days ago for a while, because we were exceptionally busy, and we've had tons and dozens of emails saying, when is the next podcast? I'm waiting. So that says a lot that people are interested in conversations from us older queer people. So thank you. And thank you to all our outreach partners. Without you, we would not be able to amplify all our work that we do. And to those who want to reach us, please write to us at theviewsroom@gmail.com. Feedback, share, comment, say anything. If you want to come on our podcast, you want to nominate yourself, you want to nominate someone else, please do feel free. We are here, and we are queer, as we say. And thank you so much from Older Queer Voices. Thank you, Sabi.